beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains, majesty above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Welcome to Election Eve, a little special program I put together to share with you just a few thoughts and a few stories about some amazing people who we should all be proud to call fellow Americans tonight. These have been very challenging, stressful, divisive, and scary times for most of us, if not all of us. And on election eve, it occurs to me that maybe this is a moment to shed some of the cynicism, some of the jadedness, some of the fear, and remember what I think so many of us have felt over the years, which is a tremendous, deep pride in the legacy and the story and the commitment that America has always represented, even in the throes of so many failings, setbacks, resistance. We are fortunate beyond description, those of us watching who live in the United States. And on the eve of a day that gives arguably the greatest individual freedom any human has ever had, I think it's good to remember where we live and all the good that America has represented and all the good that Americans have done. At the beginning of the 1960s, John F. Kennedy famously dared the American scientific community to put a man, he said, of course, put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Not because it's easy, but because it's hard. There was no technology to go to the moon. There were no rocket programs. There were no launching pads. There were no manufacturers of these devices. And America started the NASA program. It wasn't called NASA originally, with a group of men who were amongst the bravest men I imagine anyone could ever meet. One of them, a man named Louis Armstrong, was born in a small town in Ohio called Wapakoneta, Ohio, in 1930. He was a test pilot who flew over 200 different models of airplanes, including the X-15, still the fastest airplane that has ever flown, at 4,000 plus miles an hour. He himself flew the X-15 to an altitude of 200,000 feet, where the plane died and he had to glide back down after skipping off the atmosphere at 90,000 feet. That presaged his behavior and his performance on the Apollo 11 flight. when, with just minutes of fuel remaining on the lunar landing module, he discovered by looking out the window that the original landing point was simply too boulder-strewn to land. And he took that craft off of autopilot, just like he did his X-15, and he found Tranquility Base and set it down with seconds of fuel remaining before an abort would have had to be called for those men to return to Earth safely. Nerves of steel, plus skill, plus courage, plus determination, plus experience. He carried on with NASA after that flight, then became a professor, then an aviation executive. He just died in 2012, humble to his very last day, always saying he deserved no accolades, he was simply doing his job. But to the world, he represented scientific and human achievement of the highest level. And he carried that with him with integrity and honor for the rest of his days. In the middle 1800s, a man named Ferdinand Hayden fell in love with a region intersecting Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. He saw things that no one had ever seen, at least no one from the East. There were Native Americans living there. Multiple tribes had lived in that region for, it's estimated, 11,000 years. The Shoshone, Nez Perce, Blackfoot, and Crow tribes. What he saw boggled his imagination. He saw vistas and landscapes. He saw rivers that steamed and mud in the ground that boiled in the dead of winter. He saw towers of boiling water erupt unexpectedly and inexplicably. Paintings by a man named Thomas Moran, other eyewitness accounts from other visitors, and Ferdinand Hayden himself advocated protecting this place for posterity. They went to President Ulysses Grant, and Ulysses Grant signed in 1872 an order establishing a 3,500 square mile national park dedicated and set aside for the enjoyment of the people in posterity. It's easy to imagine what sort of development would have overrun Yellowstone National Park. The condos, the ski resorts, the fishing tours, the high-rises, the airports, the roads. Who knows if any of it would have been intact if it wasn't set aside. And if you have visited there, or if you ever do, you know or you will know what a miracle that was, that it was set aside. It was the world's first national park. It was a new idea, and it has been called the best idea America ever had. With a hammer and nail, I can build most anything. A treehouse for children, or a courthouse for judging. With a hammer and nail, I'll build a bank or a prison, a stage for musicians, or a skyscraping building. With a hammer and nail, a family on the street, the one you hardly see, can finally find a home. So while I have this chance, if I only have these two hands, what will I do with a hammer and nail? I do hammer hammer and nail. Oh, there's a whole world out there in desperate need of repair. What will I do? The hammer and nail, yeah. When the time has come, will I have shown my son what one man can do with a hammer and nail? In 1793, a woman named Lucretia Mott was born in Massachusetts. She was a Quaker. One of her first observations as a young woman was when she became a teacher and discovered that at the school where she taught, the men were paid significantly more than the women. She left that school, moved to Philadelphia from from Massachusetts. She took with her one of the male teachers who she married. As a Quaker, and as a woman of conscience, and as a woman of courage, Lucretia Mott had no equals. She and her fellow Quakers refused to buy any goods that could be traced back to the slave trade. No slave-produced cotton, no slave-produced sugar, no slave-produced products of any kind. She became a Quaker minister and traveled the country, speaking on the evils of slavery and on the divine spark that she perceived to exist within every human being, man or woman, black or white. She and her husband then founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was integrated from its first day. During the 1838 Anti-Slavery Convention, the hall where the convention was to be held was destroyed by a mob. She and her other delegates, white and black, linked arms and walked through the mob to safety together. She then returned to her home while a mob raged outside her home, and she sat in the parlor ready to receive her enemies face to face. One of her defining moments as an activist was when she traveled to London to the General Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840. Before the conference began, the men of the conference voted to not allow women onto the floor to represent their respective countries. There were 6 women there representing America, including Lucretia Mott. She returned from that vote energized and motivated, carried on speaking against slavery in slave-owning states. She made appointments to meet with slave owners to appeal to their conscience. She died in 1880 and was regarded at her death as one of the greatest Americans of her century. She also left 5 children who became themselves active in anti-slavery causes and other reform movements. In 1923, one form of the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, enshrining in law the equality between men and women, was called the Lucretia Mott Amendment in her honor. This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Islands, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. As I went walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway, show me a golden valley. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to a New York island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream water, this land was made for you and me. I roamed and rambled, followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of the diamond deserts, and all around me a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York islands, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land is made for you and me. Oh, this land was made for you and me. This land was made for you and me. Little town in Missouri, a little boy was born named Samuel Clemens, who mostly dreamed of being a riverboat pilot. And when he was a young man, he worked hard to become a riverboat pilot. He lived in a town in Missouri right on the Mississippi River, and trained and studied and apprenticed for several years to become a riverboat pilot, and piloted for several years and had some interesting adventures that he was storing up in his memory. Started writing about even as a young writer and steamboat pilot. He traveled to the West when the Civil War began. The story goes that he and a couple of friends endeavored to join the Civil War, joined the Army. They were in a Confederate state, so they joined the Confederacy, and that lasted all of 3 weeks. And they walked away from the Confederate Army and the Civil War. And he, Samuel Clemens, went west to Nevada, to California, and to Utah, where he began to write. He even went to Hawaii, which couldn't have been an easy trip, to write. He wrote a story called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, which established his name under his pseudonym, which was Mark Twain. Mark Twain went on, moving back to Connecticut, and over the next 17 years he went on to write some of the most beloved and brilliant books in the English language from that little town in Missouri. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Prince and the Pauper, Life on the Mississippi, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. He was also regarded really as one of the finest, if not the finest, humorists and wits in the English language. But even more than that, anti-colonialist, vehemently anti-slavery, pro-suffrage, pro-labor and workers' rights, pro-women's rights. Mark Twain. Back in New Orleans, on the other hand, in 1901, a boy was born to very, very difficult circumstances. His name was Louis Armstrong. Born into poverty deep enough that his mother worked as a prostitute. His father had abandoned him and the family when he was very little. He himself had to leave school in 5th grade to go to work to help support his mother and his family. At the age of 12 on New Year's Eve, he fired a gun into the air and was arrested on the spot. And he was sent to a home for colored boys. At that home, he was handed a cornet to play, which is a form of a trumpet, and discovered that he loved it and that he was good at it. He began to grow his reputation as a jazz musician, as an entertainer, as a singer, and as a human of exceptional warmth and generosity and joy. Becoming famous, Louis Armstrong did, for songs like Hello Dolly, Stardust, What a Wonderful World, They Can't Take That Away From Me, many, many more songs. He recorded several albums in the 1920s. He was literally decades ahead of his time. Not only a pioneer as a black artist, as a black celebrity, as a jazz musician, those albums are regarded as the most influential jazz recordings ever made, and literally inspired and have influenced and shaped the trajectory of jazz in America, an original American art form, for the entire century since. Louis Armstrong's influence has never faded. He was the first black man to receive top billing in a Hollywood movie. He co-starred with Bing Crosby in a film. I visited his home once, and it was a modest home with a really good stereo system. And the story was that whenever Louis was in town, kids from the neighborhood would flock to his front stoop, where he would sit out with them with his trumpet, tell jokes, laugh, sing them songs, and play them trumpet, and give out coins. He brought joy and authenticity and soul and spirit and a unique style that had never, ever been heard before. No one knew what to make of it. He sang, but he didn't. He played the melody, but he didn't. He smiled his way through songs. He loved his way through songs. He celebrated his way through songs. And his joy is reflected even in his own name to this day. When you picture Louis Armstrong, what do you picture? A big old smile. And that gravelly, beautiful, warm, kind voice. That's Louis Armstrong. So the question becomes, where do we start? How do we heal so much pain? The answer is clear. We open our hearts and let love wash away every stain. 'Cause peace in our time begins with a smile, with one open hand. And when we teach by example, the world is sure to understand that we are all children of the God of love. actually impossible for you and me to imagine how radical, how literally revolutionary the following words sounded at the turn of the 19th century. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. They were beholden to a king when they wrote that. There's a lot of shadow and a lot of understandable ambivalence or worse about the founding fathers who, while writing those words, owned human beings and treated them worse than the animals in their fields. Those words, however, actually paved the way for an undoing of that atrocious, tragic, horrifying, incomprehensible error, crime. Those words are special. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the Pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the Pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. One of the greatest Americans that I know of was a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer, granddaughter of slaves, sharecropper. 6 years of education total. At 43 years old, without her knowledge or consent, she was sterilized by a white doctor in a state-sanctioned operation and program in Mississippi to reduce the number of black babies in that state. At 44 years old, the next year, voting rights activists arrived in her small town. She was stunned to find out that the Constitution and the law of the land gave her the right to register to vote. She had no idea. They asked for someone to raise their hand and volunteer to walk into the county registrar's office in her town in Mississippi and register to vote, and she raised her hand. She walked to the registrar's office to register and was jailed and beaten. She was then banned from being a sharecropper, lost her field. So she decided to become a voting rights activist and advocate, and traveled the South, registering poor black people in the South to vote. At the age of 45 now, the next year, she refused to get up at the counter of a restaurant that said whites only. She was again arrested, and this time beaten so savagely that she was permanently disabled. Despite death threats, murder attempts, gunfire, she founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in opposition to Mississippi's delegation to the Democratic National Convention, which was all white. She showed up with her fellow black delegates and demanded on national television in front of millions of viewers that they be seated as rightful representatives of the black people of the state of Mississippi. This woman, with 6 years of schooling, disabled from beatings, who learned she could vote at 44 years old, ran for the United States Senate in 1971. She only relatively recently died in 1977, and on her tombstone, Fannie Lou Hamer is quoted as saying, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." That's a hero. In 1880, a baby named George was born, went to Virginia Military Institute, and was immediately spotted as being uncannily brilliant at logistics, at moving soldiers around, at organizing campaigns, at getting platoons from point A to point B, and weapons and vehicles and fuel and supplies. He was a prodigy, marked for greatness in the eyes of military leadership at the turn of the 20th century, becoming the chief of staff of the Army at the dawn of World War II, expanded the American military to levels that were considered impossible and preposterous, but he did it because he knew what was going to be needed to prevail over the Japanese and the German threats rising. Few believed him when he began the campaign to increase America's military readiness. But without his insistence and leadership, World War II would have gone almost certainly a very different direction. Winston Churchill called him the organizer of victory for the Allies. He had an unshakable commitment to civilian rule over the military. 1943, he was Time magazine's Man of the Year, and consistently, repeatedly, always stamped out any rumor or hint that he would ever run for office. He was a military official in the United States, beholden to civilian leadership, and that's the way it was going to stay. After the war, after serving as the chief of staff of the Army for FDR and then for Truman, he was named Secretary of State. And that is where he had an idea that won him the Nobel Peace Prize several years later. It was called the Marshall Plan. He looked at the state of Europe after the war and saw nothing but devastation. Our allies, that so many American boys had gone overseas to save so many lives, so many countries. The countries were reduced to rubble. Their economies were reduced to nothing. Starvation was running rampant. Disease was running rampant. George Marshall knew what he was looking at. What he was looking at was a catastrophe, a humanitarian catastrophe, a political catastrophe, that America had fought to win this war, to save and rescue and free and fight side by side with our freedom-loving allies. He could not stand by and watch babies starve to death on the streets of Europe. And he began a lonely crusade to summon American will after the war. Such fatigue, such suffering, so many dead and injured. He summoned America's might and heart and conscience to begin to send money and food and supplies to Europe, where it was so desperately needed. And in doing that, in convincing the United States House of Representatives and Senate to vote for it, in doing it above board, in rallying millions of dollars in aid from a country that was desperate to look inward and lick its wounds and heal itself, he saved millions of lives and the economies of countries all over Europe. It was leadership of the highest order. When Harvard University gave him one of his many honorary degrees, they said, in terms of character, integrity, and respect for American ideals and institutions, George Marshall brooked comparison with only one other American, and that was George Washington. Humility, tenacity, wisdom, insight, foresight. George Marshall was the best of American military. And there have been many greats. It is Election Day Eve. And for those of us watching who are American citizens, tomorrow is a day of great importance. And the day after tomorrow is of equal importance. I'm hoping that this little program and these few stories about some amazing American citizens and achievements remind you, like they remind me, that we live in a country of spectacular potential and spectacular achievement. And as we all know, extraordinary room for improvement. All at the same time. It's okay. It's okay. You're imperfect. I'm imperfect. America is imperfect. But what a place to live. What a place to raise a family. What a place to serve. I do hope you have a good, peaceful, restful night tonight. And that tomorrow, as you do go vote, unless you already have, you rest easy. You have done all that you can do. The noise and the news and the headlines and the conflicts, they don't need to be predominant in your head. I wanted, even maybe for myself more than anything, I wanted pride in my country to be predominant in my head tomorrow. Hence this little show. Hence the seriousness of it. Although I will break from the seriousness of it to tell you, yes, the mark on my forehead is another construction injury. I'm not saying that a heavy, air-powered nailer fell off a ladder onto my head yesterday, and I'm not saying it didn't. But if it did, it hurt a lot. What can I do? All right. A song by Irving Berlin, Russian Jewish immigrant, a love song to the country that saved his family's life and gave him the kind of opportunities that truly no other country could have given him. His story is exceptional, and his story is ordinary. My own family was given the same opportunities. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountains to the prairies to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. You ready to sing? God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her and guide